Hi everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the Personal Statement Writing Workshop, Writing and Rules. I hope you've already watched part 1. If you didn't, I'll put a link down in the description. Part 1 was more about the big picture of the personal statement, talking about ideas, overall structure, organization, and that sort of thing. And in part 2, we're going to dive into more of the nitty-gritty and talk about grammar rules and all of those exciting sorts of things. Before we get started, I do want to remind you of the match resources we have in the library that were donated by the Alumni Association. This display is on the first bookshelf that you see when you walk in the library, and I hope you take advantage of these resources. So today we're going to talk about actually writing the personal statement. We're going to discuss some writing tips and also rules about ideas, language, grammar use, and also some troubleshooting if you're having trouble getting started, if you're having trouble brainstorming, just some things that you can do to help you overcome writer's block and get that personal statement written. So in part 1, we spent a while talking about the ideas and organization and structure, but at the end of the day, you actually have to, write something for your personal statement. When you first start writing your personal statement, I don't want you to worry about getting everything perfect in the first draft. Sometimes it is really helpful if you just get the stuff out on the page first, and then you worry about the technical part. It can help you organize your thoughts and ideas, kind of do some self-discovery about what it is you want to discuss in your personal statement, and you don't have to worry about it being perfect. You just get the words out on the page, and then you can revise later. So we're going to talk about these 6 rules to keep in mind when you're writing your personal statement. I'm going to go into more detail about each of them. But some rules to keep in mind after you've already gotten everything out on the page and you're working on your revision on your second draft. I want you to remember to use formal language throughout the personal statement. This is a formal essay. It's not supposed to be conversational or casual. You want to use an active voice, not passive language. We'll talk about that in more detail here in a minute. I want you to remember to show, don't tell. Again, we're going to go into more detail. You want to avoid cliches and generic statements. You don't want to use a thesaurus for every single word. And you want to vary your sentence lengths and avoid repetition and awkwardness. So the first rule I want to talk about is using formal language. So this isn't a casual essay, it is a formal essay. It is kind of a cover letter for a job application. So you do want to make sure that you're using the appropriate tone and language. You don't want to stray too far outside the box, get too creative with your wording choices. You want to avoid contractions like don't, can't, and there. This isn't a hard and fast rule, but it does tend to make your writing look a little more casual, so you want to avoid those where you can. Avoid slang and jargon. I know in part 1 we talked about using medical jargon and how we kind of want to avoid that, but you want to avoid slang and jargon in general too, even when it's not about medical terminology. If you are writing about pediatrics, you want to say children, not kids, just a more formal way of saying children, and you want to avoid using casual language. This is an example of a paragraph that is using just a little bit too casual of language, and this example is from doctorsintraining.com. In college and medical school, I got to coach 11 to 14-year-old kids soccer in my local community. It was neat to see how the kids got better over time. I led them to victory several times, and they blew the top off the GCSL championship 2 times in a row. I'd never been able to know I would enjoy hanging out and working with teens without this early experience. So you can see that I've kind of highlighted in this paragraph where things got a little too casual. I got to kids soccer, it was neat, they blew the top off. This could be rewritten in a different way. I also highlighted where this author is saying I over and over again. So you can kind of see that those I's start to jump out at you, and that's something that you want to make sure that you avoid in the personal statement as well. So how could this have been better? Instead of saying I got to coach, the author could have just said I coached. Instead of saying kids soccer, they should have said children's soccer. Instead of saying it was neat, which aside from being casual, it also really isn't very detailed, could have said it was gratifying or rewarding or any number of words besides being neat or cool. The next rule I want to talk about is using an active voice, not a passive voice. So when you write in a passive voice, you emphasize the thing that is receiving the action. But if you write in an active voice, you emphasize the thing that is performing the action. This can be a little complicated, so let's look at some examples. So this is an example of a passive sentence. a personal statement was written by Sue Smith. So you can see that the person who performed the action, Sue Smith, is all the way at the end of the sentence. The action is in the middle, and the thing that received the action, or the receiver, is at the very beginning, the personal statement. We want this to be the other way around, because Sue Smith is the star of this sentence, and you're the star of your personal statement. You want to be writing things in an active voice, showing that you are the one performing the actions, not just the action was passively done by you. So to turn this into an active sentence, we would say Sue Smith wrote a personal statement. So the performer is at the very beginning, the action is in the middle, and the receiver is at the end. This is a much better way to write this. It reads better, it is more clearly understood, and as a bonus, it takes fewer words to say the same thing. And in your personal statement, real estate is kind of at a prime, so you want to be thinking about how you can use less words to say what you want to say, and an active voice is a really good way to do that. Here are a couple of other examples. Instead of saying, my mind was changed, the active way to say that would be patient X or situation X changed my mind about ... Instead of saying the car was driven, say I drove the car. Instead of saying his life was saved, say Dr. X saved his life. Instead of saying I was taught by Dr. X, you can say Dr. X taught me ... This is really easy to fall into writing in a passive voice, especially when you're writing about yourself and you feel kind of uncomfortable about it, which is really common. I think we are all familiar with trying to write about ourselves, but also not sound like we're bragging or something like that. And it can be easy to slip into passive voice, but just change all of that into the active voice, and it's going to read better, and it's going to be shorter, and it'll be much better for your personal statement. The next rule I want to talk about is this idea of show something, don't tell something. So this rule of show, don't tell is very important when it comes to writing stories and fiction, but it's also really important when it comes to writing these kinds of essays. Instead of saying, I'm a compassionate person, instead you can tell a story in which you show compassion. So this example is from a personal statement from a student here at LSU Health, and they wrote, on my internal medicine rotation, I participated in the care of a woman who was left aphasic after a devastating stroke. She was without family, so I visited her often to offer a comforting hand squeeze and a familiar face. So all of this is saying, I'm a compassionate person, without actually saying the words, I'm a compassionate person. And it gives a more detailed look at the person behind the personal statement. Rather than they think they're a compassionate person, they're showing that they're a compassionate person. So you want to think about what you want to say about yourself, and then find a story or an anecdote that illustrates that point. Instead of saying, I like the idea of being able to care for my patients from childhood to adulthood, you can tell a story that illustrates this. So this example, again, is from another essay from a student here at LSU Health. During the rotation, I was able to care for a 21-year-old with end-stage renal disease and subsequent heart failure. It was a tough case and a life-changing experience. Talking with this patient about when he was originally diagnosed with lupus as a pediatric patient and how the disease had affected him into adulthood made me realize that I wanted to be a doctor who could bridge the gap from child care to adult care. So all of this is saying what that first sentence says, right? I like the idea of being able to care for my patients from childhood to adulthood, but it's using a story, a patient encounter to show that fact instead of just stating it. Instead of saying, I like to form relationships with my patients, or I'm attentive to detail, tell a story that illustrates this. So another example from a student here. During this rotation, I was able to identify the signs of a pulmonary embolism in a patient because I had built a relationship with him over the course of a few days and knew his reports of pain were out of character. Because of this relationship, timely interventions could be initiated. So in this particular example, the student then went on to describe the details they'd caught that, combined with the relationship that they had with their patient, allowed this patient to get treatment. So this isn't an example of the student outperforming others on the team, right? I told you about that in part 1, that you don't want to give stories where you're the best and everybody else is not. But this is a story of the values of building a close relationship with your patient and being attentive to their needs and changes in their conditions. So showing something about yourself instead of telling something about yourself is going to make more of an impact on the person who reads your personal statement. Instead of saying, it's important to me to build rapport with my patients, give an example of doing just that. And this example comes from a personal statement I read that actually talks about the non-traditional career path that this particular student took and how their experiences in other fields contributed to the skills they're going to bring into a residency program. So this particular student had worked as a public school teacher before pursuing a medical career. And this is a good example of how an anecdote from your life outside of medicine can inform the type of doctor that you want to be. And in their essay, they wrote this. One student will always stand out to me. He had a history of behavioral issues and had failed multiple classes. I had to change my approach and understand his unique circumstances. I made extra time for him and treated him with dignity and respect. As we built a rapport, the change in the student was significant. So this is all saying that it's important for this author to build rapport with his patients or build rapport with the people that he is working with without actually saying those words, instead using a story to illustrate that. The next rule I want to talk about is avoiding cliches. Residency directors have seen it all. They've read everything. And if you write things like, ever since I was a little girl, I've wanted to be a doctor. If you write, my father was a surgeon, I want to follow in his footsteps. If you write, my insert relative here died of cancer, and ever since then, I knew I was going to be an oncologist. If you write, I just want to help people, these aren't really saying anything about you or anything unique to you specifically. And the residency director isn't going to learn anything about you from this. It is totally okay if you've wanted to be a doctor since you were a child, or you want to be a doctor because a parent was a doctor, or a relative died of a disease, and that is when you knew you wanted to go into medicine. Those are perfectly valid reasons, but it's not going to say anything special about you. Y'all may be a little too young for this reference, but in one episode of the show ER, they had a montage of interviewing med students for residency positions, and they just had a supercut of all of the students saying, I just want to help people, I just want to help people. And that's great, and I hope that that's true. You definitely should be wanting to help people if you're going into medicine, but if a residency director reads that in your personal statement, they're just going to roll their eyes and they're going to chuck your application in the trash. They want to know what else about that particular specialty appeals to you. They want to know about you as a unique person. So here are some examples of cliched statements from medfools.com. Establishing good rapport with patients, colleagues, and support staff has been my goal throughout medical school and will remain so throughout my medical career. I look forward to my next phase of training with great enthusiasm and strong commitment. So at first glance, these two statements kind of seem fine. There's nothing really wrong with them. I mean, who doesn't want to establish good rapport with patients? Who doesn't want a resident who's looking forward to the next phase of their training? But if you take a closer look at these, think about what are these statements saying about the student who wrote them or their specialty. They're not saying anything about it. There's nothing unique. Anyone could have said this. Anyone going into any specialty could have said this. They're just fluff. They don't really add anything to your personal statement. And again, limited space means you want to cut out that fluff. Here's another example. After enjoying every clinical rotation during my final year, I knew insert specialty was just right for me. The variety of clinical encounters, procedures, and degrees of illness makes insert specialty extremely appealing to me. Being an insert specialty physician, assessing the patient's needs, providing treatment, and recommending a next step for continued treatment is both challenging and gratifying. Each new patient presents something different, and each will provide a learning opportunity at all phases of my career. This could be about any specialty, and it's also nothing special. Assessing the patient's needs, providing treatment, recommending next steps for continued treatment, this is like the bare minimum requirement for being a doctor, and it doesn't tell me anything about how good the writer of this personal statement is going to be. It doesn't tell me anything about them. Next rule is you don't want to overdo the synonyms. You don't want to use a thesaurus for every single word because that's going to become very apparent to the person reading it. So you want to write in a way that comes naturally to you. If you can't imagine yourself saying it, don't write it. Sometimes the easiest and the best way to get your point across is to write plainly. Now, if you think that maybe you're not that good of a writer and you need to use bigger words to sound like you're a better writer, it's not going to really flow naturally when you're writing it, and it's going to be apparent to the person reading it that that's not really something that you would normally say. So you want to write in your own voice, formally in your own voice, so not in a casual voice, but definitely write in a way that comes naturally to you. This is a meme from Tumblr that shows how very obvious it is to readers when you're using a thesaurus for every word. So this says, today a student emailed over a draft of his essay on the book 1984, and he clearly used a thesaurus on every single word, and how I know this is because the party slogan, Big Brother is watching you, had become enormous sibling is viewing you, and I laughed so hard I cried. So this is an extreme example, obviously, but it is really apparent to the reader when you're just using a thesaurus and trying to find a better word for everything that you write. So you also want to vary your sentences. You want to try not to write too clinically, for lack of a better term. So this isn't a case report or a class assignment where you have to describe how to treat a patient or how they presented. You're not presenting an H&P. You are writing a story about you. It's your story. You should let your language reflect that. So in this example that we see here, it shows how varying your sentence length can make for a more pleasant reading experience. So this sentence has 5 words. Here are 5 more words. 5-word sentences are fine, but several together become monotonous. Listen to what is happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drones. It's like a stuck record. The ear demands some variety. But when you vary your sentences, you get something more like this. Now listen. I vary the sentence lengths and I create music. Music, the writing sings. It has a pleasant rhythm, a lilt, a harmony. I use short sentences, and I use sentences of medium length. And sometimes, when I'm certain the reader is rested, I will engage him with a sentence of considerable length, a sentence that burns with energy and builds with all the impetus of a crescendo, the roll of the drums, the crash of the cymbals, sounds that say, listen to this, it is important. So obviously, this example veers astray and breaks the don't get too weird or too creative rule that I mentioned earlier. But this is a good way to think about how you can vary the length of your sentences so that it doesn't sound monotonous and like it's just kind of thumping along. So you also want to avoid repetition in your writing. This essay is about you, but you want to try to avoid starting too many sentences with I or using I too much. It just starts jumping off the page, especially the way that the letter is shaped and the spaces on either side. It just is a beacon flying off the page to the reader. A way around this is to toss out anytime you say I think or I feel and just say the thing without the qualifier. As in all things, moderation is key. You can definitely start some sentences with I, just not 10 in a row, because that starts to get monotonous and kind of plodding along as well. So instead of saying, I feel privileged when a patient confides in me, you can say, it's a privilege when a patient confides in me. And wait a second, you might say, it is a privilege is in passive voice, and you'd be correct. But it's all about balance. You want to balance kind of breaking and bending the rules with each other. And if you've started 2 sentences with the word I, you want to change this one to say, it's a privilege when a patient confides in me. So in this example, getting rid of the I statement is the better choice. Instead of saying, I feel that my adventurous spirit has helped shape the person I am today, say instead, my adventurous spirit has helped shape the person I am today. You can see it also takes up less words. Instead of saying, I think the most important quality for a surgeon to have is, say, the most important quality for a surgeon to have is, ... It's your personal statement. By default, the reader knows that these are the things that you think and that you feel. So you don't want to kind of waste space by saying, I think blah, 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 or I feel blah, blah, blah. Just cut out the I think and the I feel. You will shorten your sentences. You will make it easier to read. You will cut out some of that fluff, which means you have more room in your personal statement for other stuff. Finally, the golden rule of all is that you want to proofread. You definitely want to proofread more than once. You definitely want to have someone else look at it too. Several someones if possible. A peer, a trusted faculty advisor, even someone completely unrelated to the medical field is a good choice to read your personal statement. So you'll probably be giving your personal statement to the people you've selected to write your letters of recommendation. And you can ask them for advice too, if you want, but you may want to choose someone who's not going to be writing you a letter of recommendation just to look at your essay and see if they think that that essay is a good picture of you. So I know that I have thrown a lot of stuff at you and a lot of rules. I'm telling you to be creative, but not too creative. I'm telling you to write plainly and naturally, but to vary your sentences. I'm telling you to not say I too much, but you have to write about yourself. And I'm telling you to avoid cliches, even though you're going to be the zillionth person to apply to this residency program. And I'm telling you to show, don't tell, but you only have a page to work with. It is all about balance. So all of these rules that I've talked about are guidelines. You can't follow them all. You will break some. It's okay. You just want to see where you're breaking a rule a lot in a row and change it around. Like we talked about earlier, using too many I statements in a row is going to just leap off the page at the reader, and instead you might want to break a rule and put in a passive sentence in there instead. And that's fine to create variation. You definitely want to write in a way that's genuine to you. Don't try to be something you're not. You're going to be fine. Some tips for you is you can read sentences out loud to test whether they flow naturally. So if you are reading a sentence out loud and you're finding that you have to kind of stop and take breaths where there aren't commas and those sorts of things, maybe it's a little too long. Maybe you want to cut that sentence down and make it sound like something you would say. And definitely, like I said before, have someone else read your essay and give some feedback. Now, what if you're stuck? If you don't know how to begin, you can start in the middle of your personal statement. So sometimes it's really hard to start an essay with an introduction. Maybe you don't know what you're going to write about yet. How can you write an introduction if you don't know what's going to be in the rest of the essay? Sometimes it's easier to just get all of that stuff down on paper, and then once you know what your essay is going to be about, then you can write the introduction. If you can't figure out how to start in the middle and you're still feeling that writer's block, do some more brainstorming. So you can make some lists, you can go over your notes from your rotation in this particular specialty that you're applying to. You can write down a meaningful encounter that you had with a patient without putting that expectation on yourself of fitting it all into the essay. So you can always edit stuff later. Definitely keep in mind that you're going to be revising this more than once, over and over again. It's okay if the first thing that ends up on the paper isn't great. It's okay if the first thing that ends up on the paper doesn't actually end up in your personal statement. So you just want to let it rest a while, and then you can revisit. So you could write one big long story about an encounter with a patient. Maybe it takes you a whole page to just write about this story with the patient. But maybe at the end of that page, you're going to find what you really wanted to say about it. And then you can use just those couple of sentences in your personal statement. So don't put the pressure on yourself of opening up a blank document and thinking, I'm going to write my personal statement beginning, middle, and end. It's just going to be one page and then I'm done. Be flexible with yourself and let yourself just do some writing just to get the words out onto the page. It is much easier to go back and revise what you've already written than just trying to start with the very first sentence of the very first paragraph of the introduction. So I do want to also address some ERAS-specific quirks. So you're going to be writing your personal statement in a Word document, probably. But when you enter this into ERAS, you're not going to upload the document. You're actually going to copy and paste all of the text, and you're going to put it into a little box on the ERAS system. And then when this goes to your residency programs, they download all of that stuff, so everything kind of gets formatted automatically and put into a PDF for them. So that's what they're actually going to see is the PDF of what you put into that little box. But you can also generate the PDF from that little box to see what it's going to look like when the residency programs get it. So this ERAS box is going to give you much more space than you actually need. It's going to tell you how many characters you can fit in there, and it's going to be a lot. But when the residency director downloads that personal statement, they're really only going to read that first page. And if it goes longer than a page, they're going to give up. So you definitely want to keep it short. So keep it to about a page in Word, put it into ERAS, make sure you download it, generate that PDF and download it to see what it's actually going to look like. And then you can do some more revising after that. And as I mentioned earlier, there are also going to be separate spaces in the ERAS application to enter your CV, so keep all that CV stuff out of your personal statement, and any information about extenuating circumstances. So if you failed STEP or failed a class, or if you took a semester off or a year off, you don't have to spend some time talking about that in the personal statement because there's other places to address that. And remember, we want to keep the personal statement positive. We don't want to waste space in the personal statement by talking about some of these other things. So again, we do have a LibGuide that is all about the residency program application resources from AAMC, ebooks, available through the library's website, helpful websites. I will link this in the description. Again, I do encourage you to use our writing consultant service. So this is a person who works remotely. If you email the shivlibwriting@lsuhsc.edu, this will get sent to our writing consultant, and her turnaround time is usually 24 to 48 hours. Obviously, the earlier that you're working on your personal statement, the better. And if you do want to talk to someone in person, I am here and available to assist you whenever I have time to do so. So just shoot me an email, or you can stop by my office and we can talk about your personal statement. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can email me. My email address will be in the description below. I hope you found this helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you so much and have a great day.